This is a recording of a presentation shared with the Pima Association of Governments Low Impact Development Working Group on September 20th of 2022. So today, I wanted to share the successes, challenges, and what's next for water conservation strategies in my community, which happens to be a homeowners association. For those of you who don't live in an HOA, let me share a little bit of background on how our community operates. Within my HOA, residents agree to abide by community rules and covenants and also pay monthly dues that are managed by an HOA board and management company. These fees support services that might otherwise be handled by the city, and this is all meant to sustain property values. Now, although there are many in our community who support water harvesting to help with water conservation and climate change resiliency, highlighting improved property values and/or lower maintenance costs really helps us realize support for associated activities across all spectrums. My HOA is located in the Tucson Mountains, about 6 miles northwest of downtown Tucson, Arizona. Our community hosts 411 homes in a topographically rich area that's traversed by 2 washes that drain into Roger Wash to the east, with a community footprint of about 162 acres in the hosting subwatershed. We also host about 1.5 miles of walking paths that are lined with native vegetation as originally required by Pima County for permitting the development. Our community also hosts large open spaces that are essential for drainage and wildlife corridors, which are required to be left unimproved with the exception of erosion control activities that are the responsibility of the HOA to address when needed. Now, stormwater has been a challenge where I live in regards to erosion of our common area walking paths and downcutting of our local washes, which puts drainage infrastructure at risk. Since this was a yearly challenge contributing to high maintenance costs, we hired Watershed Management Group about 7 years ago to provide training to community volunteers on sustainable practices for path maintenance. After the training, we installed approximately 15 basins throughout our community to help with erosion, this being an example of one that was installed as recently as 2021. And we've also done some erosion control work in open areas in line with professional guidance provided by Watershed Management Group. Given the HOA framework we live in, our community established the Water Harvesting and Erosion Control Committee to keep the effort alive. This was important not only for paving the way for future conservation, but also to hold committee members personally responsible for maintaining these efforts over time. As part of our charter, we included surveying our common area irrigation for water use and leaks. In order to manage our irrigation, we needed to understand the extent of our irrigated areas as well as the water meters serving the same. So this map was created to help us along those lines, with the green showing the areas that are irrigated and the blue dots being the Tucson water meters that serve the same. We then took advantage of a service offered by Tucson Water to have our prior watering evaluated by a conservation specialist through a review of historical bills. In response, Tucson Water informed us that we had an irrigation scheduling problem and that we are not following scientific guidelines for watering, essentially to cut back during the winter months when plants are dormant and increase as needed during our summer months prior to the monsoon. In response, we shared the report with our common area landscapers for adjustment. And here you can see the results, with coordination taking place with our landscapers and a subsequent 50% reduction in watering over the next 3 years. In addition to helping us save over 3 million gallons over the course of 5 years, that small conservation effort also helped us save $16,000 in Tucson water billing for irrigating our common areas. And this doesn't account for increases in Tucson water billing over that period of time. Although the progress we've made is great, things have flatlined over the last 3 years, leaving us with new opportunities for water conservation and lowering maintenance costs. In order to see how we can further improve, it helps to briefly go over the paradigm of common area maintenance within an HOA and some of the challenges we encounter. So when you live within an HOA, typically you're going to be working with a property management company, and the associated manager is likely going to be assigned many accounts, and he or she is going to focus specifically on paying the bills, hosting meetings, and guiding actions for your HOA in line with your community's bylaws. Now, the HOA dues pay the bills, but since they're managed by a property management company, it's not always easy for residents to see what they're paying for. It's not like you're getting a water bill delivered to your house for common area irrigation. So what happens is community costs are typically aggregated in an annual report that's shared during an annual meeting, and as such, costs for irrigation and associated leaks can sometimes be a little hidden from view. And proper oversight really does require dedicated volunteers to be engaging with that property management company, with Tucson Water, to understand what the current and historical water use is, to see if there are any outliers or problems in the system. So when you don't have this proper oversight, essentially what you're doing is encouraging high water use. Specifically, remember that your landscapers are the ones who are going to be responsible for your drip irrigation system. And of course, they're going to want to please you as the customer. They're going to want to keep areas looking fresh. But remember that they're doing so using water that you're paying for. And as a result, there's really no incentive for efficiency unless you write it into your contract or you communicate that directly with your landscapers. And the other challenge, of course, is removal of ground cover, which can leave areas bare and exposed and subject to evaporation, thereby increasing water demand. And this is one example within our own HOA that's visited frequently by landscapers. And you can see here that the area has been blown and raked so much that we just don't have any leaf litter, we don't have any topsoil, we don't have any mulch, so much so that the tree roots are exposed. So we removed all the nutrient cycling, which isn't healthy for the trees, and any rainwater or irrigation that we apply to this area is essentially going to be lost to evaporation very quickly. And of course, let's not forget that overwatering our desert natives encourages rapid growth, and that can turn into higher maintenance costs, which are justified because we need to keep our traffic ways and our walkways safe for residents, and it becomes a vicious cycle that needs to be put into check. So I think the bottom line is that HOAs and other managed properties like business parks aren't really set up for efficiency. They're not entirely transparent. They're not accountable without a lot of effort from dedicated volunteers. And I think the term that Brad Lancaster would use is they're degenerative systems. That's just not really a sustainable model for the challenges we face with respect to drought in the Southwest. So certainly our own HOA has already implemented some generative strategies, but I wanted to look towards the future to see how we can improve on what we've already done. So I'm going to start first with improving our common area water visibility. So within our own HOA, I've already talked a little bit about how we've mapped out our irrigation system. We know where our water meters are located, and we typically on a monthly basis visit the Tucson Water Payment Portal and capture all that water use data in a spreadsheet, which can then be used to generate reports that can be shared with landscapers, with the board, to focus our attention on meters that aren't behaving as they should. The challenge being that this approach is very time intensive, it's not user friendly, there's got to be a better way to do this for sustainability. So one approach that we're exploring is the use of Esri's ArcGIS web maps to help make our water use a little more accessible and visible to the community at large. And here you can see that associated data is now available online to members of our community. This graph essentially shows what our aggregate cost and consumption is for common area irrigation, and it does so in real time, or at least on the resolution of our Tucson Water billing. So that's a little bit more user-friendly, a little bit easier to reference and report out to the board on. And the nice thing about web maps is we can actually take a more granular look at the data. So we can actually break down those aggregate costs and ferret out which meters might be contributing to the same. And since we're dealing with maps, we can actually minimize the graph, and we can actually get a geospatial understanding of where those high costs are associated. And we can show this to our landscapers and present this to the board for further investigation. And even take a more granular look at the data, focusing in on 1 meter and seeing how it's performed over the last 3 years. And even take it one step further and see how it's performed by season, in this case the data that was available for summer over the last 3 years. So with this data in a more user-friendly format, we can see what we would expect to consume and pay for water in the year 2022 as compared to prior years. And then we can highlight periods of time where we actually paid and consumed more water than would be expected for the same period of time, We can then take a more granular look at the data, find out which meters are causing problems. That's exactly what we did. We found a meter that had a significant leak. The leak was repaired, and our associated consumption and cost went down, thanks to having this data in a user-friendly format. And just to put that 143,000 gallons into perspective, this is an 870-gallon water harvesting tank that stands a little over 6 feet tall, installed in my own backyard. And I'm going to have to fill this tank 164 times to offset the water that we lost from the leak and some poor irrigation timing in our common area over the course of 2 months. And I think that this really demonstrates the importance of being able to see that data and respond to that data rapidly so that we don't have to offset those losses accordingly. And this is just an example of a graph that you can generate that basically breaks down your water consumption over time. We'd like to see next to no water in the winter and a little heavier water use in the spring and early summer up through the monsoon. So this helps highlight associated issues. And this graph breaks down our water consumption by meter over the last 3 years. So here you can see that meter 443322 is one of our biggest consumers, and it might actually provide some low-hanging fruit for us to realize greater conservation. So next, I'd like to briefly talk about improving technology for realizing irrigation efficiency. So here's our irrigation timer that's located at the entrance of our community, and most managed properties are going to be on drip. They're going to have a similar irrigation timer under lock and key. So we have multiple timers distributed throughout our HOA. This is one of them, and our landscaper informs me that this is the way they're programmed. Basically, in October, they're set to water 3 days a week for 30 minutes. And then in May, in the spring and summer, they water for 60 minutes, 5 days a week. Now, the challenge with a drip system is, of course, they're not responsive to monsoons. So what can happen is we can have a rainfall event, and we could be watering the ground the very morning after. And here's a short video clip that I prepared for my HOA demonstrating the same. All right, folks, so here's the challenge we've got with our drip system. The first thing is, we had 2/10 of an inch of rain last night, and the ground is wet throughout. I mean, it was a good soaking rain, and yet our drip system is on. So I'm gonna go shut things down to save water and to save money, and then we're gonna try to install some soil moisture sensors to get a better feel for when things should be turned back on. But this is waste. So the way we've responded to this in the past is there's no change in our irrigation timer unless somebody makes a request through the common area chair for the HOA. They in turn need to submit a request to our landscape contractors. The contractors actually have to come out to our community to shut things down, and they may not be able to address it immediately. Sometimes they do, sometimes it may take 1 or 2 days. And we also don't have any clear guidance on when to turn things back on. So this is challenging in regards to water conservation. Now within our own HOA, we do have soil moisture sensors, which gave me a little bit of hope that maybe we could be a little bit more efficient on this front. But soil moisture sensors actually come with their own set of challenges. For starters, you really need to know where to install the sensor in regards to your vegetation. Luckily, we do have some guidance from the University of Arizona on where those sensors can be located, but you also need to know the kind of soil that you're dealing with, since different kinds of soils will have more or less water available for associated plants. This is captured in the associated manual for the sensor, but really you need to know what you're doing. You need to reference table or have local experience regarding soils, so you know how to program these things, and then you need to observe the results of your programming and adjust as needed over time. So effectiveness really requires soil expertise, proper sensor placement, and refinement over time. And in the busy world of HOA management, sometimes these things can be neglected. In response, I reached out to our landscapers and I asked them, hey, we've got the soil moisture sensor out in our common area. Does it work? And I also wanted information on where it was installed. Specifically, I was concerned if the sensor was installed under the eaves of the gatehouse, which would, of course, bias results. And the response from the landscaper was, I don't believe that sensor is doing anything at all, and I don't have a clue where it's located. Didn't even know there was one up there. So that's a challenge with technology. You can install it, but if you don't monitor it and keep an eye on it and check on it, you're just basically wasting your money. And the point that I'm trying to get across is that smart systems are only as smart as the users that are managing them. And if they're complicated and we expect these to be hands-off systems, they just will not be efficient over time. We're just wasting our money. So at the request of the Common Area Chair, I have been investigating alternatives that might be a little more user-friendly. I've been looking at these capacitance-type soil moisture sensors, and these will basically generate a signal that's proportional to the volumetric water content of our soil, but they're expensive. One site can cost us $500 to engineer, so that would be for a logger that costs about $300 and $100 per sensor. So in response, I wanted to see if we could actually deploy something like this at lower cost. And I discovered that the same sensors that are used by this one particular commercial outfit can be purchased for about $1.50 on eBay. So that's like a 99 or 98.5% discount on the sensor. So that's a good start. At the same time, these sensors do need to have a calibration curve generated for the soil. So it's not a simple solution, but it certainly puts us in the right direction with respect to cost. In regard to a logger that can talk to the sensor, we can build and program our own for about $80, which is much less than the $300 we would pay for a commercial sensor. That, coupled with the fact that each sensor would only cost us $10 for PVC tubing to install at a given depth, that opens up some interesting possibilities for monitoring soil moisture throughout our HOA. Specifically, we can install 13 nested pairs of sensors throughout the community and build 2 loggers that we can use to visit these sensors after rainstorms to figure out what the soil moisture looks like at depth. So that would cost us a little over $500, and consider the fact that we could do this for the cost of just purchasing 1 logger and 2 soil moisture sensors and having those installed at the gatehouse. This approach gives us a much better idea of what's going on in the community with respect to soil moisture. So this is a conceptual model of what we're trying to get at. Within our own HOA, we have vegetation of varying sizes. We've got trees, we've got shrubs, and they're all going to have different rooting zones. So the idea is to install these sensors to better characterize the areas that are being watered by placing those sensors specific to the root zones of associated vegetation. When we have a monsoon that comes through and the soil is wetted, this gives us an opportunity to turn off the drip irrigation system because we don't want to waste water. But when things dry out, we're going to be left wondering, are things still wet at depth? One way to address this is to come out with a shovel and actually dig a hole, but our soils are pretty compact. That's not a very user-friendly way to do things. So another way is to actually visit these installed soil moisture sensors with our loggers and actually measure what's going on at depth to better inform when our drip irrigation system should be turned on. Now this is an ambitious project. It does require the development of rating curves specific for our soils, but we're working on it. So currently I'm using weight to help me determine what the volumetric water content is of that soil column and then comparing that to the sensor response. And this is one of my early graphs on the same. The interesting thing about this is I noticed that the top of the column was very dry, and I noticed that my sensor was telling me that things were still very wet. I thought, man, that can't be right. So I actually pulled it out, and sure enough, it was very wet. I should have left it alone. The point being that this is an excellent example of what we're dealing with in our HOA when we look at the ground and the ground looks very dry and we say, oh, we need to turn the drip system back on, when in fact things underneath may actually be very well saturated and supporting the plants just fine. So in regards to our next generative strategy, I wanted to talk about improving opportunities for volunteerism. So in regards to the technology I just described, of course, it would be great to have volunteers who can actually go out into the landscape and take measurements 2 or 3 days after a rainfall event and let us know if conditions are ripe for turning on the irrigation or just leaving things alone. This is a much better approach than the guesswork of kicking the dirt and trying to decide whether or not the irrigation should be turned back on when in fact the root zone may be wetted at depth. So yet another opportunity has to do with the timers and our irrigated zones within our HOA. Currently we know where the timers are located, but we don't know what they're irrigating. We don't know the extent. In the case of the gatehouse, we have 5 zones that are irrigated, and unfortunately our landscaper doesn't know what those zones are. So we may have to turn some things on and off to kind of understand what the wetted extent of our irrigation zone is. And I'm guessing that if this is a problem in our HOA, it's probably a problem in many other HOAs as well. Once we have that figured out, we can actually match our water meters to those irrigated zones, so we know where to look for leaks when we do see that we have a problem with high water use. We also need to evaluate the placement of our drip lines. They haven't been moved for years. In fact, I'm working with our landscape contractors at this moment to try to get that addressed. But in many cases, they're not where they should be relative to the canopy of the irrigated vegetation. You can see that the emitters are not placed properly relative to the plants. We're basically encouraging root rot by having this watering where it is. That's just not the right way to do it. The other challenge we have is a lot of our water harvesting basins haven't been maintained over the years, so they've filled in. So they need to be redeveloped, and we also need to mulch these so that they do more than just erosion control. They actually help us store water in the soil over time. And we also need to develop proper spillways. In many cases, our water harvesting basins are backfilling back onto our paths rather than shunting water off to another part of the landscape that could actually use it. And of course, there's new opportunities for taking problem areas where we have erosion and turning them into opportunities for capturing stormwater, improving vegetation and shade cover within our HOA. And who knows, maybe over time we can get a group of dedicated volunteers that can help us with all these activities within the HOA, similar to what Dunbar Springs has with their own neighborhood foresters program. Next, we certainly want to memorialize the changes that are taking place in our community and highlight the wins. So this is important because when new members come to the community, they may look at the landscape and think it's always looked as great as it has, not realizing that there's a lot of volunteer hours and effort that went into getting things to look the way they do today. And we actually already have this to some extent. We do have a YouTube video summarizing some of the changes that have taken place thanks to the recommendations of Watershed Management Group and the ongoing dedication of our volunteers. I'll include a link in the description of this video. But now we think that there might be an opportunity to actually embed this information in a story map. For example, here's a site on Tombolo where we had a lot of erosion back on July 2014. And this is what it looks like today. So the point being that wouldn't it be great if new members of the community could walk our paths, could actually track their progress on their phones via access to web maps, and see what these sites look like before and after as a credit to not only the volunteers, but the increased property values that result from us taking care of our common areas. Next, I think there's an opportunity to link conservation to lower maintenance costs, and you guys will recall that that's certainly a universal motivator for these activities, as I mentioned at the start of this video. And currently, we're paying over $5,000 a month to maintain our common areas, which is a significant portion of our monthly dues. And I think if we start practicing some of these alternatives by improving our soil, by leaving smalls in place so that we don't have to use as much water, and encourage shade by doing less frequent pruning, really focusing on quality versus quantity, I think our maintenance costs should decrease over time, or at least that's the goal. It's something that we can certainly track. And finally, I think conservation can certainly be linked to higher property values. And one way we're trying to realize this is through Pima County recognition of our community as a case study in low-impact development. In fact, we have been asked to submit a case study summary report. This is what it looked like. We submitted it before COVID, and then things kind of went on the back burner, but we're trying to reignite that interest in our community to have Pima County recognize us accordingly as a low-impact development case study for the broader community as an example to other HOAs. And if we can realize that recognition, I think it would give us an opportunity to put yet a second sign next to our community wildlife habitat recognition at the entrance of our community. And I think that this kind of recognition certainly supports our shared goals with the county with respect to climate change resiliency and water conservation, and it also helps property values, frankly. So we speak to a broader audience within our HOA to help us support associated activities. So in closing, I quickly wanted to summarize areas we need help with. So we're going to have our landscape contract come up for renewal pretty soon. We would like to know to make sure that the bidding process is competitive. If you have recommendations for landscapers or irrigation contractors, arborists as well, that can help us get a competitive bid working for our community. We'd also really appreciate county recognition for the years of effort with solid metrics that this community has realized on behalf of developing strategies for climate change resiliency. We're working with Tucson Water right now on a web service for helping to maintain our web map to make it a little bit more user-friendly. Coordination on our soil moisture monitoring approach with academics at the University of Arizona would be most appreciated. And also any opportunity to cost match to host professional workshops within our community for our volunteers and or to purchase mulch would be greatly appreciated. And I think if we can get support on any of these recommendations or requests for support, I certainly promise to keep you and our community informed on what is and isn't working for feedback and adjustment moving forward. So my sincere thanks to those of you who watched the entire video. I certainly hope that for those of you who are working in your own HOAs on conservation measures, that there was something here that was helpful to you. And I look forward to your comments, suggestions, and recommendations in the comments section of this video. Thanks again. Have a great evening.